Hey, everybody. Welcome back to not another episode of Rent Prep for Landlords, but the 200th episode. This is exciting stuff, Steve.
This is a big milestone, 200. I don't know if I've ever stuck anything out 200 of anything in my life. That's a lot.
Yeah. So what we're going to do on this episode is we're going to kind of go back down a trip down memory lane here. And we're going to go all the way back to the 30th episode we're going to start with. But we're going to kind of play little sections of some of our favorite episodes and discuss them a little bit and give you guys some insights on why we picked those episodes. But before we do that, we're going to play our current intro music. And then later we're going to hear the original Landlord University intro music too.
The original is terrible. Just want to throw that out there. You might want to just stick around to hear that just for the sake of saying, what were these guys thinking? That's really bad.
I mean, if you're unfamiliar, the podcast used to be called Landlord University. Steve, you co-host, what was his name? Jeff Pearson?
Jeff Pearson. I met Jeff in an entrepreneur mastermind group, hung out with him down in Vegas at social media marketing
Examiner?
Something like that. Yeah, whatever it was. I remember meeting Penn and Teller. It was a fun, interesting trip, hanging out in Vegas and then hanging out with Jeff. And we hit it off really well. And we did, over 100 podcast episodes together. And he was a great friend of the show. And Jeff moved on professionally, landed a sweet gig as a marching band director.
Yeah.
Yes, that's real. That's a real thing.
Yeah. He may be the only person on the planet that was like, yeah, I was dabbling in doing podcast hosting, and then I left so I could pursue, being a marching band director.
Right, for some national marching band. It's a big deal, and he, good for Jeff. I wish him all the best. He was an awesome co-host, and really was a big driving force in starting the podcast. He was somebody that said, hey, you're in an interesting line of work. You got an interesting perspective on things. You need to get on podcasting. And so I really got to give credit where it's due. Jeff pushed me in the right direction big time on the podcast.
Cool. Well, let's roll the current intro music, and then we'll hear Jeff's intro music later.
All right.
1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah.
Welcome to the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. And now your hosts, Stephen White and Eric Worrell.
All right, so the first episode that we're going to go back in the archives is episode number 30, which is an episode of Night School, and it's about tenants who damage the property. So Night School was a concept that you guys had where you'd kind of, I'll let you explain it. You're the one that actually ran with it. So
yeah, Night School was short clips giving anecdotal tips and tricks and sharing information. We take a lot of phone calls from landlords at that time. When this episode first had come out, I was kind of making my rounds on the circuit of different speaking engagements with landlord associations and real estate investment groups. So I was like at the peak of talking to as many landlords as you can possibly talk to in the period of time that I did it in. I feel like I had sometimes 50 conversations a day with landlords for months on end. And so I was just filled with all this information, stories, and everything else. And this was an interesting story that I thought I would share. And turns out, as you reminded me, Eric, I've shared this story now probably 10 other times because it was interesting enough.
That's why I had to put this one on there, because I feel like it comes up in several episodes. So
I feel like when the guy told me the story, I swear to you, like he had a tear in his eye. Like this, it was brutal.
Yeah.
This was a landlord that had seen things and came back, and had a story to tell.
All right, well, let's give it a listen.
I've heard some really, really terrible stories. A recent one that jumps out of my memory is a landlord who said his tenant dumped quickcrete concrete, that powder concrete, down the toilet.
Oh.
Yeah, and it locked up, it froze up the lines everywhere all the way out to the street. They had to dig up the driveway. It ended up costing $27,000 in damage. Sometimes it's more than just a broken window or a broken door or a hole punched in the wall. Sometimes it's some serious damage that, realistically, you'll never get that money back. That tenant's never going to pay that landlord $27,000 to replace that. If they're the type of person that's putting concrete in a toilet, you're not going to get paid from them.
All right. Well, this story comes up a lot.
Yeah.
And it's a sad one. We don't want anybody to ever have to deal with this. But episode number 30 is an interesting one to listen to. You can hear more about that story. But it also highlights the SOTA form, which is the form that you're going to want to use if you do have damage in your rental property, because that's important to, always follow the process anytime you have a tenant who's causing mischief.
Yep.
Because they're also the ones that are going to fight you, probably more likely than a tenant you didn't have problems with.
Yep.
So give a listen to that episode number 30. Learn how to use a soda form, and hear a little bit more on that story that Steve was sharing. And if you happen to have been listening to a lot of our episodes, you probably heard it in other podcasts too. Okay, so moving forward, what we're going to be listening to next is episode number 66. So this was actually a segment called In the News. Steve, do you want to explain how you came up with that concept and what it's about?
Yeah. I think at the time I probably had Google Alerts set up or something like that. And, I'm getting fed landlord stories and catching stuff, in news articles, things like that about landlords and tenants. And I thought it was interesting enough that it would be something to share on the podcast. We ended up bringing in Jennifer, who was a content writer for us for years. Love Jennifer. She's awesome. And she did an awesome job with these In the News segments, pulling out really interesting, current event type news stories that involve landlords, tenants, landlords doing crazy things, cutting holes in floors, tenants doing crazy things. I mean, it was,
and these In the News segments, I think we're actually going to try to bring them back a little bit because it was a fun piece, and we're going to have some fun with that. So I'm going to actually play this one from the beginning of the episode because I feel like we need some nostalgia as far as the original intro music for Landlord University that Jeff put together for us.
Well, I just want to make this clear too. Jeff did not. This is not Jeff's voice on here.
Oh, okay.
This was a voiceover guy. It was Jeff's idea. Jeff wanted to go with kind of like a masterpiece theater theme. I don't know why it was cool that I was like, okay, whatever. But looking back on it now, you hear it and I'm like, ooh, that's pretty brutal. But yeah.
All right. So let's listen to the beginning of episode 66.
Nothing will crush a real estate investor's spirit like landlord stress. The difference between being successful and miserable in managing properties is education. Welcome to Landlord University, where landlords learn. Landlord University is recorded from inside the Rent Prep office, where Stephen White and Jeff Pearson share the lessons learned from working with some of the most successful landlords.
Welcome to Landlord University in the News. I'm Jeff Pearson, and this is my co-host,
Stephen White.
Hello, Stephen. How are you doing?
Pretty good, Jeff. Glad for our second episode of In the News here, and we've got Jennifer Maughan on the line as well.
Hello, Jennifer.
Hi, how are you guys?
We're doing well. So you brought us some more fun stories.
Oh, this has been a great week for landlord stories. The first story that I have to share with you is actually about a new report that's come out just this week about America's aging population and the housing shortage that it looks like they'll be facing. This week, a joint report was released called Housing America's Older Adults, Meeting the Needs of an Aging Population. It was done by Harvard University and the AARP Foundation. And basically, the report found that there is not enough adequate housing for seniors, and that's going to be a problem as the population ages over the next 15 years to about the year 2030. Many of the units today that are available and in the near future are unsuitable for the disabled, and there's not enough affordable housing or landlords that are participating in affordable housing programs.
So yeah, I thought this one was kind of interesting because it's still applicable even though this was a few years ago. Because when you're talking about some of the trends that we pulled up in this in the news segment here, this is definitely something that we've heard over and over again though on the podcast as far as
let's address what we're all thinking right now. All right. That sounded like an NPR segment that you immediately turn off when you get on. You're like, oh, I'm going to go to sleep. Man, I mean, the intro music, Jeff's voice is straight out of like NPR. It reminds me of like a
very professional.
Yeah. So,
hello, Stephen.
Hello, Stephen.
And I like the edited in Stephen White, where he's like, and with my co-host Stephen White. Sounds like a voicemail when it says, "Say your name," and you get that awkward Stephen White.
Yeah.
Press 4.
Yeah, it was. A lot of just getting through it and seeing what stuck, seeing what worked. But we definitely loved the In the News segments so much that we're bringing it back. So
yeah, well, I think too, there's a little bit of a story within a story there, though, as far as like, if you're a landlord and you're trying to build your rental portfolio and you're slowly chugging away at it, and it feels like you're making mistakes along the way. It's like everything, right? You got to start somewhere.
Yeah.
You figure things out as you go. It gets better. It gets easier with more experience. Not that, we're by any means podcast superstars at this point, but the audio quality has gotten better. The production has gotten better. The flow and the fluidity of it, I think, has gotten better. And we're still trying to figure it out.
Our
as we go.
timing's gotten better. Yeah, we're still trying to figure it out, but huge difference looking back some of those early episodes. And you're 100% right. You gotta fail your way through things, and figuring them out as you go and learning as you go. So, yeah, good lesson learned there.
Yeah. So, how'd you come up with the in the news segments? If you want to just talk a little bit about that and why we're going to be bringing those back.
Just interesting, we'd get fed those news stories, read it, and be like, "Oh, that's really interesting." From the perspective of a landlord or a landlord that's been through something that's now going on in the news. And sometimes it was just what we like to call landlord porn, which is just crazy stories of tenants burning houses down or kicking holes in the wall, whatever tenants do, that landlords secretly love to hear these stories because they want to know that they're not alone in this world.
Yeah. Or at least somebody's doing it worse than they are.
Yeah, exactly. You know what? It's
addictive story. It's the stuff that you see that gets shared. Like,
yes.
You see anything that's like really helpful content that's like, hey, here's how to be a better landlord. If you see that on Facebook, it probably has 6 views. But then if you see the video of the guy who's got an apartment that's completely trashed and there's bugs everywhere, you'll look down and they'll have like 1 million views.
Yeah. Look, I think of like back in school, right? If you forgot your homework, what's the first thing you do when you get into class? You immediately look to your friends and go, I didn't do my homework. Did you do yours? Because you want them to say, no, I didn't do mine either. You don't want to be the only guy that didn't do his homework. So same concept. I think landlords love hearing stories of other landlords' struggle and what they've gone through and what they've been through. And a lot of landlords, deservingly so, wear these stories as a badge of honor. These are their service ribbons. They've put in their time and deservingly so. They've earned some respect for sure.
Well, let's get to the next episode that we're going to play a clip from here. This is episode number 81, which is the top 5 eviction mistakes most landlords make. So we're going to start off at about the 6:32 mark here. So let's take a listen.
Yeah. So, telling a tenant, I'm going to give you, or I want you out by the end of the month, or you got till the end of the month to get out. Not good enough. It needs to be, in order to support legal action for an eviction, it needs to be in writing and it needs to have a specific date attached to it. End of the month doesn't count. It needs to be on the 30th, the 31st of, October 2014, whatever that is. Make sure that it's very, very specific.
So I thought that this clip was interesting just because of the entire podcast, actually. You're talking about the top 5 eviction mistakes that landlords make. So in that particular clip, what you're talking about is actually being specific and having a notice that people you need to fill out a notice and you need to have that eviction have all the information. It's not just like, hey, I need you out in a month. It's like you're out on this date and it's very specific. And the rest of that podcast, you walk through some of the stories because in the Facebook group, we see that where people get emotional and they just kind of wing it when it comes to an eviction. And I mean, you did all the research on this and years of talking to landlords. That's when they kind of end up in I've up the creek without a paddle
for sure. And there's nothing more disheartening than talking to a landlord who lost a court case based on a technicality, and we see that a lot. One of the podcast episodes we talked about a landlord who returned a security deposit in cash and didn't write any kind of formal receipt or anything. The person, the tenant takes them to court and sues them saying they never received the cash, and the landlord ended up having to pay it again. So lesson learned, everything needs to be documented. Everything needs to be done a certain way. And I think that's one thing we've always tried to do on the podcast is to share experiences, share mistakes as an opportunity to avoid them ourselves for sure.
Yeah. Well, this next episode, what we're going to be going to is episode 107, which is another night school episode. And this one's talking about what a pay stub can tell you about an applicant. I like this. We actually got a little bit of Jeff on here. I feel like we need to get some representation for
Jeff. Are we talking about, am I talking about in this one where I've seen the faked pay stubs?
No.
Oh.
If somebody wants to hear that, they'll need to listen to the full episode. So,
cool.
Why don't we go to hear? This is a clip from episode 107 on what a pay stub can tell you about an applicant.
We're going to now talk about pay stubs and how valuable a pay stub can be during the application process, even if you've already verified their income. So you may have already called their employer, or you hired Rent Prep to call their employer, and we've done the verification, and we've gotten the information on, what their position is, their start date, and their salary, and all that. So what other things can the pay stub tell you about an applicant? And Jeff, being in HR, you know that a lot of times on your pay stub, there's a lot of hidden gems in there for a landlord.
Yes. Obviously you can usually get the Social Security number, but year-to-date earnings, which is going to tell you how long they've been working there. So if it's September and they're making $2,000 a pay period and they only have $6,000 year-to-date earnings, then they've only had that job for a short period of time.
Exactly. And another thing, if you're dealing with somebody who's on a commission job, that year-to-date earnings could really tell you a lot too, because what they claim that they're making, a lot of times what I've signed does not add up what their actual year-to-date earnings are.
So one thing we should highlight, your microphone's gotten a lot better.
My microphone's gotten better. My takeaway on this is just a quick reminder to landlords: you can go ahead and change the speed on your a lot of podcast players that you have and play it maybe at 1.5 speed or even 2 speed if you want. So on the older episodes, you may want to do that.
1.25, that gets a little too. You know what? I had a professor in college who talks kind of slow, so I'd watch when I went to University of Buffalo. I remember my mom being kind of like, "What the heck?" Like, they helped me out with tuition, and they're like, "You're not even going to class half the time. You're just watching it online."
Right.
I was kind of like maybe that first generation that started having classes online, and I had this professor that I'd watch in double speed, and then I'd have to go to class for the exams.
Real weird to see
so
him,
it was weird when he talked at normal speed.
Yeah.
I'd be like, "Oh my, who is this person?"
Yeah.
I only knew you in double speed.
Right.
Yeah. But I liked some of the insights there from Jeff as far as talking about analyzing the pay stub.
Yeah.
So you're not just looking to make sure, okay, yeah, they make this much money. You can kind of reverse engineer the total amount on the pay stub and figure out, when did this person actually start working? Does it line up with what they said in the rental application? Because, employment history is going to be a very important factor if you're considering a tenant applicant, because you want somebody who's got stable employment so they can afford the rent.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so that's definitely one worth checking out. Again, that was episode 107 on the importance on looking into and analyzing pay stubs. So this next episode that we're going to be highlighting here is episode 141, and it's on the importance of having a vision. So we actually had a guest into the office, Dr. Roger Firestein, who's a friend of mine. He's a creativity professor at Buffalo State University, and he is actually one of the pioneers of creativity. And one of the sections that he's really gotten involved in, and one of the things he's really dived deep into, is creating a vision for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought it'd be interesting to have him into the office to talk about this, because if you don't have a vision for what you're doing as far as real estate, it can be a tough one, because you're going to run into some bumpy roads, whether it's a bad tenant or a leaky roof, or it's hard to I think in general landlords need to have good vision, because you're giving up a lot of your assets up front for a long-term vision.
Yeah, you have to have your eyes firmly set on the horizon and what's ahead, versus always just living in the moment and gauging it, basing your happiness on that exact moment, because you're going to go through, like you said, some pretty rough patches. You got to have that farther out vision. And I think this is a cool episode because this marks around the beginning of when you started on the podcast, Eric. So I remember Roger being maybe like episode 1 or 2 when you were on.
Yeah. I think he was like the third person. So episode 141, I probably came in around like 140, 139.
Yeah, and Roger's a cool guy. This is one of those situations where you wish you had video on it, because he's an animated character. You know what I mean? He looks like a creative professor. Like if I had to tell you what a creative professor looks like, just in your mind, picture it. That's probably what Roger looks like.
Yeah, and he actually read us a quote to start this episode off. So this is the very beginning of the episode, and he's got a great voice for radio.
Yeah, he really does.
So we're just going to listen to this, and let's hear it right now.
The poorest person in the world is not the one without money, but the one without a vision.
1, 2, 3, 4, yeah.
Hey, what's going on, landlords? This is Eric here at the Rent Prep offices, and we are here with Steve White, and we also have a special guest in the office today. His name is Dr. Roger Firestein. Roger, you want to say hello?
Good afternoon, everybody. Hello, hello.
Yes, so Dr. Roger Firestein, he is a creativity professor. He has pretty much pioneered creativity in many ways. He has been in the, how long have you been in the game for?
I don't really want to say it, 40 years. So,
Yeah. So one of the things I get a takeaway on that is the awkward introductions that I do sometimes. And I remember actually when we were interviewing him, I don't know why I said, you know, how long have you been in the game for?
Yeah.
Like this is the crack game or something. Like, how long have you been slinging rock for, Roger?
You know, been in the game, and it was, and he was one of the rare guests that we've had in the office. He was a local guy, so we had him right in our Rent Prep office for the podcast. So yeah, I think physically I could see that you were uncomfortable or anxious being in as early on. You know
what? It actually reminded me of I had to give a report in college. I forget what it was on. We did actually know what it was. The iPhone was coming out. So this was 2000.
You're old.
Yeah,
man.
right. This was 2007. The iPhone was coming out like that spring, that summer.
Okay.
And it was for a market research class. And I was clearly actually the smart kid in my group. And I was one doing most of the work. And I had 4 other guys. And they were just kind of, just, I don't know, just being super lazy through the whole process.
Mhm.
And I think I kind of adapted their qualities as we were going through this project together. Because I was like, yeah, you know what? I'm going to be the kid who doesn't care and does very little. So when it came to actually talking about it that day, I did no preparation for it at all. And these guys didn't care because they're used to just winging it. And
Right.
I wasn't. And I had to stand in front of my class, and my face got red, and I was just kind of
Your first time winging it.
yeah. And it was like, it might have been my last time winging it.
Yeah.
And, sometimes I overthink things. And I think when Roger came in, for some reason, I started getting the yips a little bit when I was trying to do the introduction. And I was just like, oh, Roger.
Well, plus you had a good relationship with Roger. I think it was somebody you looked up to.
Mhm.
So, it was, I think that you were, a little bit nervous because.
Well, it was like the second or third podcast I've ever done.
True.
Yeah. So get off my back, Steve.
I didn't care. I was like, get in there, learn, Eric. Do
Yeah.
this. Yeah. You're my new podcast partner.
Thank you for saying partner. I felt like you were going to take that somewhere else for some reason.
All right. What do we got next here?
So in this next clip, we're actually going to episode 149. And this one is on credit changes that were coming down the pipe. So this happened actually July of 2017. There was, I forget the acronym. What is it? NACP? Is that what it is? National Association of Credit? I'm trying to think of the actual.
NAPBS, National Association of Professional Background Screeners?
No, the conglomerate that came together, Equifax,
Oh, yeah.
TransUnion,
Yep.
and I always blank, Experian.
Yeah.
Well, they came together. They've kind of remodeled the way that they're going to do credit reports to be more fair to the people having their credit run on them.
Yeah.
And what they did is they removed judgments and liens and most tax liens.
Yeah.
I should say. In July of 2017. So this episode, we're going to discuss that. And we got a little bit that we're going to discuss after this, kind of give you some more insights. So again, this was episode 149 on credit changes landlords should know about.
A little known policy shift that took effect in March 2017 that is going to affect 12 million people who will see a jump in their credit scores.
Hey, welcome everybody to the podcast. We have an interesting topic here today. And, as you know, I'm Eric Worrell and I'm with Steve White, the co-host of the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. And I'm going to kind of pump Steve up a little bit before we get into this topic here, because I really truly believe there may be nobody better to talk about this topic as far as credit scores. If landlords are kind of running credit reports on their tenants and their applicants to see if they are a good fit for their property, there's a huge change coming down the pipe.
I was shaken, honestly, when I heard in March 2017, the announcement came out from the 3 major credit bureaus, which is TransUnion, Equifax, and Experian, that they were going to have a policy shift, that they were no longer going to report civil judgments and tax liens on people's credit reports, which is very, very scary, especially if you're a landlord that has a judgment against somebody. In the past, that's been maybe the only leverage you've had as a landlord to say, if you don't pay this, I'm going to get a judgment against you. And anyone who has a judgment knows having a judgment means almost nothing. It's your ability to execute that judgment, it's your ability to collect on that judgment.
So I thought this was interesting to play because actually when I was playing this back, it was good information again, because it's not just the fact of running a tenant screening report or a background check through a company like us at RentPrep, that there's not going to be as much information on there, but there's also less leverage that the landlord has on a tenant who may, kind of short them on rent or damages.
Yeah, I still am shocked by this move. And there's been some updates. At the time that we recorded this, they underestimated the numbers. It actually impacted more than 20 million people. And I still believe, I'm not a doomsday type of person, but I still believe that this is a major move that will play some role in a future financial collapse once again. I can't imagine that improving 20 million people's credit scores, erroneously like this, where it's not credit they've earned. It's because you're taking away a derogatory remark on their credit based on a technicality. It's not good. It's not going to be good for the economy. I promise you that. But it is still shocking to me. There's been an update recently. TransUnion specifically was toying with the idea of keeping some liens on there. They tried to unsuccessfully. They just announced as of March 2018 that in April they're going to be removing everything. So they're following suit.
Is that all liens or just tax liens?
All liens.
Okay.
Most of the liens that we see are tax liens. I mean, you get some occasional, mechanics liens or utility bill lien against you for not paying utilities, things like that. But again, pretty relevant stuff. Landlords want to know that, and landlords certainly want to be able to have the ability to affect somebody's credit still. Mm-hmm. And the judgment was usually the path that they did it. So this was not a great thing for landlords, honestly.
Yeah. And if a landlord wants to run a credit report, then, so let's say like we offer the TransUnion Smart Move report, this information will now be pulled out of those reports.
Yeah.
But if they want like a custom background report, that can still be included.
Yeah. The RentPrep report, we pull judgments and liens from court records versus credit reports. So we can still provide that information. It's just no longer being included in credit and having an impact on that person's credit. So you get this false narrative that's happening where somebody looks like they may have better credit than they do, and realistically they've got a judgment against them or something derogatory that is just not being reported now.
Yeah, and hopefully down the line we'll be able to add that in as an extra service on the Smart Move reports for the people that really like seeing the credit reports. Mm-hmm. That's just something we've got to work on the back end with development to get that figured out.
Yeah, and I know that for landlords in particular, so if you're talking about a judgment from Capital One Bank, let's say, there's enough of a chain of events that have happened before that judgment that it's going to impact their credit negatively. So they would have been late on probably 3 months worth of payments. So that's going to have an impact on their credit. That's going to show late payments. Then they're going to go into a default status, go into collections. Again, that's all tracked through credit. Then as it goes through collections and collections can't collect it, they're going to probably sell it off to a collection agency, which is going to end up on their credit. Okay. And then finally, that collection agency is likely going to get a judgment against them. And that's where the buck stops. For a landlord doesn't affect a person's credit the minute that person pays late or goes a month or two late. A landlord really only has an impact on that person's credit when the judgment is filed because of an eviction or an abandonment, or they owe you money, after they move out. So this really does impact landlords the hardest. This isn't a huge deal for creditors. They're still going to have an impact on credit for people who, have poor credit habits. But for landlords, this is a death blow. This is not good.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not all rainbows and roses over here on the 200th episode, but why don't we get to the next episode? And what we're going to be listening to on this one is moving one episode further into episode number 150. This is the 5th round of Landlord Balderdash.
Did I ever win that?
No.
Man,
no,
really terrible at
you
that
did
game.
win a couple.
all right.
The final one here, I believe you lost, so you ended up having to get electrocuted. But I think that might be included on this episode. Why don't we give this a listen? Again, this is episode 150, round 5 of Landlord Balderdash.
So this was like after a lot of kicking ideas around, and we're like, why don't we just shock each other. I don't want the loser have to get shocked. So that's where we're at right now. I can't believe I agreed to this, but yeah, there's a potential I'm going to be shocking myself soon.
I love it. And I hope that Steve picks the wrong story today so I don't have to be involved in this little game going forward. So why don't we cue the Landlord Balderdash music?
This is Landlord Balderdash, the game where you guess which landlord story is real and which one is Balderdash.
All right, Steve, are you ready for your first story?
I'm ready. We're doing 2, right?
Yep.
All right. Let's do it.
Here's the first story. In one of my rental properties, the tenants stopped paying rent almost right away. I had the locks changed on them, went to the property 2 weeks later to find the place an absolute mess. Poo on most of the walls, holes in all of the walls, a whole toilet missing, bathtub full of cat litter, kitchen covered in dirty plates from 3 months, old KFC in the fridge, the carpet was completely ruined, and cigarette butts everywhere. $16,000 later on my investment property is back on track. I never did manage to recover my stove or toilet from the old tenants, but the insurance covered most of it.
Okay.
So a few things to unpack here.
Interesting fact, it only took 150 episodes to bring up poo on the wall.
Yeah. Steve and I were both laughing like little kids as he said poo. But yeah, I do like the voiceover on the Landlord Balderdash.
Yeah.
Landlord Balderdash.
We got to bring that back for a couple episodes. I like that.
Yeah. So if you want to find out if that story was real or not, if it was Balderdash, you have to listen to the episode. If you go back through some of the previous episodes, we have 5 different episodes we aired of Landlord Balderdash. And basically the idea is Steve has to guess which story is real, which one's Balderdash, and then it ended up culminating with Steve getting electrocuted.
Yeah, which looking back, you have some sadistic obsession with it, was shocking me. I've realized over.
It's come up many times in our business.
A lot. Like I've gotten shocked in front of people during presentations now. I've gotten shocked on video countless times. For a long time, the video on our homepage of our website, which gets 150,000 visitors a month, had me getting shocked on the homepage. So I was getting shocked everywhere.
I think I was the one electrocuting you on that one too.
Yeah. You now that I'm thinking about it in perspective.
We all have our things, Steve. Yeah. We all,
clearly
get joy in certain ways, just, let me have it.
Yeah. Well, I know that in our next episode, we interviewed a guy that we met in our Facebook community.
Yep.
And I think this is a good opportunity to bring up a community that we're super proud of. Has grown exponentially in the past year. We've got to be up to 7,000 landlord members at this time. We're proud of the fact that every member has been screened. We're a screening company. What kind of screening company would we be if we weren't screening members of our community, making sure that they were people that can contribute to the community and bring something to the table.
Yeah.
So this is a very pure community that we're proud of, where there's not any...
There's no posting of your rentals.
Sales
that's
stuff.
The problem with the Facebook groups and Reddit and all those. Like some of the communities can get pretty just solicitation after solicitation. If you check out Rent Prep for Landlords Facebook group, you can just search for that. Same as the name of this podcast. You can search for it on Facebook. You will find the best community for landlords and property managers on Facebook. And I don't feel like I'm throwing fluff by saying that.
No, I agree.
So check that out. And that's how we met our guest on, this is episode number 159 we're going to be listening to. His name is Lee McCarron, and he works for a couple different property management companies out in the Bay Area. I think at this time he was actually working for a different company. When we recorded this episode, he's since moved to a new one, but he also teaches courses on property management. And he had some really good tips on the rental application process. But during this piece of the episode, we're going to be discussing how he uses Google Voice in his business. So let's take a listen to episode 159. So I was hoping you might be able to elaborate kind of like how you manage communications with new tenants, especially using technology such as Google Voice, and what you found over your years of managing properties.
Yeah, I learned really quickly that there are people who are on Craigslist at 3 a.m. on a Wednesday, and they think that's a really good time to call and check the availability of my unit. And, I do want that call, but I also don't want that to ring my cell phone next to me while I'm sleeping. So I got a Google Voice account. And one of the great things about Google Voice is that you can set quiet hours on it. I think it's called Do Not Disturb hours. And so I just set it, don't ring between I think I set it for 8 p.m. and 7:45 a.m. I was talking to you about, I used it for a fair housing defense. We had some people who may or may not be professional fair housing accusers, for lack of a better term.
Okay.
And they, there was a claim that we were discriminating against them because they didn't give us, or we didn't give them a rental application. And the process that we use for rental applications that's also through Google Voice.
I was going to say, yeah. Can you elaborate on that? How do you use Google Voice? Because I remember actually talking about this last week with you, and I was kind of curious about that. How do you use Google Voice with your rental application process? Oh, I'm cutting it off there.
Oh, cliffhanger.
Yeah, you got to have a couple of them in there. But Lee, super impressed with his rental application process. He walked us through the entire process of how he, markets his rentals, but then from the point that somebody calls the first time to showing them the rental and then showing them criteria. And I think that little portion there, he was talking about how he actually defended a discrimination claim via Google Voice records, what I thought was really fascinating.
Yeah, for sure. And Lee's, definitely go back, give that episode a listen if you haven't heard it. Lee's a super interesting guy that figured a lot of stuff out. And I can totally see why he'd be working with different companies, because they're bringing him on to basically create systems and processes for them on how to operate better. And he's the guy perfectly suited for that. He's figured out a lot of things and how to systematize managing properties.
Yeah, I think one of the things too that you may find interesting, if you're looking to grow your business, some of the things that Lee's talking about, he said made it very easy for him to add another person into the fold who's going to help him manage leads coming in using Google Voice and kind of his communication strategies. So a lot of the stuff that he's figured out, I believe he actually, if my memory serves me correct, used to work in IT before he got into property management. And he kind of took some of his knowledge and way of assessing problems and situations and processes and pulling that from the IT world into what he's doing as a property manager. So definitely worth a listen. That was episode number 159 with Lee McCarron on the rental application process and also using Google Voice in your business. So the next episode that we're going to be going to here is episode number 166. So this one actually came from a post. This one actually got split up into two episodes, 166 and 167. And we had a local landlord who's in the Facebook group, I believe her name is Jessica, ask a question about what your best landlord advice is. And this thread ended up getting like 100 comments in it and was just such a great thread that we actually read through some of those comments on the podcast and kind of gave some perspective on that. So let's take a listen to the beginning of episode 166. All right, now that we have that awkward intro out of the way, Steve, this week, I thought we'd keep it pretty simple. We are talking about a specific post, and you probably hear us talk about all the time in our Facebook group. It's because we love it. We have this Rent Prep for Landlords Facebook group. When you search for it, Rent Prep is one word, RENTPREP. And we had a conversation come up, and Jessica, who's actually, I believe, local here in Buffalo, asked, what's your best landlord advice? Pretty simple question. But as of making this podcast, we've had about like 60 people at least chime in on it. And I thought we could go down the list. And you haven't seen the post yet.
No.
So I want to throw out some things here and get your reaction to them. Okay.
Yep.
So what is your best landlord advice? So let's look at the first one here that came up. Never make your last month's rent the same as a security deposit. What's your thoughts on that?
Never make your last month's rent the same as your security deposit.
Yeah, that came from Miss D.
So I'm assuming what Miss D means is that don't accept your last month's rent as the security deposit?
So yeah, there was some question on this, and what she had said was because your rent payment should be rent and the deposit should never be for damages. If a tenant leases up in April and they don't pay the rent, most say, okay, we'll just use a security deposit.
Yeah, terrible idea. So yes. I could tell you from a lot of conversations with landlords and seeing this firsthand plenty of times in the collections world, you do not want to bank on the fact that there's going to be no damages and you're not going to need that security deposit. And a lot of landlords, I think, in experience mostly, would easily say, well, yeah, we'll just use that security deposit. I have it. It's in hand. That's your last month's rent. But avoid that temptation because you will run into a situation eventually where that security deposit pays the last month's rent they're gone. And then you go through and do your walkthrough and you go, oh man, they kicked a hole in the wall. Oh man, we got to replace this. We got to replace that. And you got nothing left. You don't have a security deposit to draw out of. So, and most leases are written with the language to explain that the security deposit is not meant to be used for rent.
And there's a reason there's a security deposit. It's a separate thing. So let's unpack this one.
I'm very breathy. I've lost some weight since then. I think it was Fat Steve just having a hard time breathing, just getting through podcasts probably.
Fat Steve.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, that particular episode though is a good listen. I don't know if that's actually the best nugget from there. There's some really good insights from there, but that one, it's worth mentioning. The, especially a beginner landlord, they may use the security deposit to cover the last month's rent.
Oh, it's such a mistake.
Yeah.
I hear about it a lot though.
Yeah. And that's just one of about, I want to say maybe like 30 different tips that we covered in episode 166 and 167 on your best landlord advice. So I would definitely recommend going back and checking out that episode, both of those episodes, because you're going to get a ton of actionable advice that you can use as a landlord.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So this next clip comes from episode number 180 with Steve's laughing over here.
I'm laughing because I remember you telling me, hey, we got this guy, Mark Kohler, I've been talking to, and he's super energetic and he's charismatic and he's great on video. And I want you to see this video. And you showed me the video. You pull it up on Facebook or wherever it was. And in the video, Mark Kohler's getting ready to start his presentation. He takes a big sip of Mountain Dew and he goes, this episode's sponsored by Mountain Dew. And you looked at me dead serious and go, do you think Mountain Dew sponsors him? That's all I remember from
He
that.
doesn't it's like his stick. He slams Mountain Dew before a lot of his episodes.
Right. So Mountain Dew does not sponsor him.
In case
as
you
it
guys
turns out.
don't know this, maybe you don't listen to the episodes regularly here. Steve's got a brain that just kind of, a butterfly comes in the room. He's going to start wondering about that butterfly and then think about, how long a butterfly has been around for? You think, where they get the name butterfly? I mean, are they made of butter? Well, I mean, they are kind of like a fly, but butter, saturated fats are bad. Oh, I shouldn't do that for lunch today. Maybe I should go over here. And then, so
I'm like a big kid.
Yeah, and I'm on a podcast with him while this is going on.
Yeah.
And I go, okay, why don't we rein that back in and talk about episode number 180 with Mark Kohler. So what we got here is he gave us 5 tips on if you're doing an LLC. Asset protection comes up a lot in the Facebook group. People wondering if it's worth doing an LLC. Mark sets these up for a living for people, but he gives us 5 tips. And we're going to start this one off at about the 1348 mark of episode number 180, where Mark's giving his 5th tip on setting up an LLC and managing an LLC for your rental properties.
I think it's important to point out too, really quick, that Mark is an attorney and an accountant, and specifically works a lot with property investors.
All right, let's give it a listen.
But you've got to follow this procedure, and that's what creates the asset protection. The LLC in the long run is so affordable if you just treat it like an LLC and not just have that sheet in the drawer and think if there's a problem, you're going to be covered. You're not. You got to maintain it.
So, Mark, when it comes to setting up an LLC, like I'm listening to this and it might sound like a little bit like overwhelming. So what would you say to somebody if they're like, all right, you're looking at separate checks and like having to run this LLC and you're talking about holdings and all this stuff. What would you say to somebody if they're kind of feeling overwhelmed about the idea of setting up an LLC? So we're going to pause it right there. And you're going to have to listen to that episode number 180 to learn more about LLCs. But I think that's important because I think the overwhelm that people have setting up an LLC is why they don't set up the LLC. So in that episode, we have Mark kind of break down what's happening with the LLC and what you really need to understand to get it set up. And his team can actually take care of a lot of that for you too. But I thought it was a really good episode because he took kind of a confusing subject matter for a lot of landlords and really broke it down and explained the common pitfalls that landlords fall into when they try to set up an LLC.
Yeah, and I remember he went over pretty specific details too. And the takeaway for me was basically how bad landlords have it in California for LLCs, right? Super expensive. They got to pay the annual the annual fees on it, and it's much more expensive than in any other state. So he dives down pretty deep into details there, and it's definitely worth a listen for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So next we're going to go to episode number 181. So
one of my favorites.
Yeah, this was an idea that I had kind of percolating for a while. I like to do goofy impersonations sometimes, and decided to just make an entire episode out of impersonations.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not famous people, but just kind of our own little voices. Steve actually makes an appearance in here a couple times, which we'll point out after the fact in case you can't tell.
I'm not an impressionist.
Well, the idea behind these was we were going to do kind of like, well, not a Judge Judy, but People's Court style episodes. And props to our audio engineer, Luca, who actually made the music for this and put these episodes together and editing this episode because this is not an easy episode to edit. So
no, and this is one of my favorites. This is like takes me right back to when I was a kid. I used to watch People's Court all the time, Judge Wapner. And as soon as I heard the intro on this with the tapping of the typewriter, the over dramatic voice, who announces what the case is about, it was like taking me right back to being a kid. I love this episode.
All right, let's take a listen to episode 181, Rem Prep Court, Security Deposit Pudding. Hey, landlords. We're really excited to share with you a new concept here on the Rem Prep for Landlords podcast. We're going to be taking you inside of the courtroom. Not a real one, but an imaginary one. We're calling it Rem Prep Court, and we got a host of characters, and we're going to get to them right after this.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Welcome to the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. And now your hosts, Stephen White and Eric Worrell.
This is Edward Cullen. He's a landlord from Kentucky, and he says the defendant was a terrible renter. He's suing for $1,048 in damages that exceeded the security deposit. This is the defendant, Jake Ombry, who lived in one of Edward's rentals in Kentucky, and he claims the rental was clean when he finished his lease. He says his landlord is trying to extort money from his security deposit. He says he's always paid on time and that Edward just wants money because he's a slumlord.
Will all parties please raise their right hand?
What you're about to hear is only real in your imagination. The judgments are fictitious, but real-life lessons are waiting around the bend. Welcome to Rem Prep Court.
All rise for the Honorable Judge Rudy Fortune.
I think that's enough of that episode.
I that was such a fun episode to do. You did awesome with the voices. The story was great. If people are wondering why we didn't do more of them, it's because that they were super labor intensive.
Yeah, I started keeping track of my time on those ones, and they were running me about 4 to 7 hours, depending on the episode, between coming up with the storyline, doing the voices, stitching it together. I had to feel like I needed to really do a good job for audio engineer to stitch everything together. So I was already packaging everything for him. At the end of the week, I was like, you know what? I got a full-time job as the marketing director here at Rent Prep. I don't know if I should be spending 7 hours on doing goofy voices for the podcast episode, as much as I enjoyed doing it.
Yeah.
You know, if I had a full-time job just doing the podcast, I maybe would, revive that one. But it got a little time. I kept thinking of the word insensitive. You know what? I'm doing this intermittent fasting program. It's 2:00. I haven't eaten yet today. It's not working well for my thought pattern here.
Right.
But
well, I think the takeaway there, we'll probably bring that back at some point, maybe for an episode or two, because it was super fun and it was awesome. But definitely a lot of work went into it. But I think it shows.
You know what I've thought about doing? You know how like Jimmy Fallon, I think, does this where they have the wheel and like they'll have a guest on like Christina Aguilera and they'll spin the wheel.
Wheel
and they
of
have
Impressions.
To sing. Yeah, Wheel of Impressions. And they have to do like, it'd be like Sesame Street, but in Michael Jackson.
Yeah.
I think what's his face from Maroon 5 did that. It was really good if you haven't seen it. But I've thought about we've thought about doing this segment where we read just asinine blog comments that we get on our blog. And we get a lot of them. Like some of them, like we'll probably fire up a landlord because they're just like a renter who's like, I don't care.
Yeah.
But I thought we could do like our own Wheel of Impressions and spin it.
Yeah.
And then have to, whatever it lands on, read that blog comment in that impression.
I
don't know. Maybe it's a little too weird.
So it could be like Morgan Freeman saying that he admits that he lies about having an ESA just so he can have a pet in the property.
Exactly.
I like that. Yeah.
Yes, I had the emotional support animal for a very long time, but my landlord is a
Exactly.
I'm going to have to edit that out now. All right. But why don't we move on? This episode's getting kind of long, but hey, it's our 200th. We can do what we want.
Yeah.
It's our party. We can cry if we want to, right?
Sure. So episode 189, we've got Mark Ferguson, who was another super interesting guest. Great guy, loved having him on, and really got a ton of positive feedback, more than usual, I would say, from this particular guest.
Yeah, and Mark's got the Invest for More podcast and blog, and one of the cool things about Mark is like he's in the trenches. I mean, this guy has done like over 100 flips. He owns, I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, the amount of rental properties he owns. He might be at like 16, 18, but at a certain point, he flipped into a different aspect of real estate investing, and he's built up a team around him. And, you know, he's a realtor, he's doing flips, rental properties, REOs. If you name it, he's done it in real estate. And it shows when he's talking about some of the trends in the industry. So we're going to play a little bit of a clip from him on this episode, number 189, talking about how to grow a team. So let's take a listen to that. So how did you go about, like, when you started and you said you first got into buying rentals, were you doing that mainly on your own? You were probably the real estate agent too. Like, how did you start to build your team that you've gotten to the point that you can handle as much stuff as you have going on now?
So I kind of hired my dad always had a little team, kind of like me, him, and one assistant. And then when I started getting really busy with the REO stuff and HUD stuff, I hired another assistant for myself. And then we hired kind of another agent, another assistant. So we had 4 or 5 people on the team. And when I first started buying properties, you know, it's all me. I'd find the properties. I decide if they're good rentals or not. I'd go get the financing. I was paying for all of them myself. And then as things progressed, you know, we started doing more flips and things. I ended up buying out my dad. So I have more aggressive goals than he does and would buy more interesting properties than he did. So when I bought him out, then I kind of hired one of my really good friends from college to run the team. We hired some more agents, kind of built it out bigger. And then, you know, the REO HUD stuff pretty much disappeared because of our market. And so that's another reason why I went more into flipping, is because of that. And so my assistant kind of became a full-time project manager. We really just switched from selling 200 houses a year as agents to flipping. So kind of like you guys told me how you went from your credit collections company to tenant screening, is kind of like that. We had the same people, just kind of switched what their roles were.
So that episode with Mark, really interesting. I mean, we talked about so many different aspects of real estate, but one of the biggest takeaways I got was his ability to grow his team. I think when we started the episode out, he was saying he closed on like 2 or 3 homes, and he was in Walt Disney World with his family. So it's pretty interesting hearing his story, and his podcast at Invest for More is a great one to listen to as far as real estate investing and following trends and figuring out what you want to do, and just listening to his story of how he's built up his business.
Yeah. And that brings us to our final spotlight here on our 200th episode. A guy, last but certainly not least, super interesting, very creative in the way that he invests. He invested in cell phone towers, which grabbed our attention.
Big time.
Yeah. And so he was another great guest, great positive feedback. A lot of people loved hearing it. And I think he gave a lot of landlords some really great ideas and advice.
Yeah. So this is episode number 195 with Jay Massey of Cashflow Diary. And I'm actually going to play it off at the beginning, kind of getting some of Jay's background story of how he got started in business in general. I'll let Jay explain the situation that he found himself with. And let's take a listen to episode number 195 with Jay Massey. Jay, I'm really impressed with a lot of the things that you've been able to accomplish. I mean, you got a great following online of people that are really learning a lot from you and being able to grow their real estate portfolios and investments in unusual ways. But before we get to all of that, I'd really like to hear about your background story. I mean, how did you get involved in investing? I mean, where does your story begin?
Yeah, well, it begins with tragedy. Like, I mean, I think how many of your guests have that in common? Yeah. Where it's like, but at the end of the day, one of the things I want to say to everybody before they hear it is, I did not wake up one day and say, ooh, I want to do real estate. It was more of a solution to a problem that my wife and I were experiencing. So when my wife is pregnant, she has a condition known as hyperemesis. Basically, that means she can't eat or drink while pregnant. And that was stressful for me. I was born with asthma, and one day to go blow off steam, I went to play volleyball. And I jumped to spike the ball, landed on a guy's head, punctured my lung, which then I developed a condition known as pleurisy. So if you can imagine, here's the situation is my wife can't eat or drink, also meaning she can't work. And I can't walk or talk simultaneously without fainting, also meaning I can't work. And even though we had our 6 to 10 months of expenses set aside, because that was good financial planning practice, it was one of those times where we realized 6 to 10 months might not be enough if you end up in a very interesting, quote unquote, medical situation.
Sure.
And what happened is I realized a very painful lesson. I had been told, like many others, go to school, get good grades, get a job. That's what it was. But that plan didn't really work for me. And I found out that I didn't really need a job, but what I needed was a source of income. And that was a key distinction that I required in order to make some changes. So I started selling our personal possessions on eBay. This is back in the days when CompUSA, for those of you who remember, when that store was going out of business. So I would go buy their inventory at a discount and then just clean it up a little bit, take some better photos, market it better, and put it online on eBay and sell it for the markup in the middle. And we would start to do thousands of dollars and tens of thousands of dollars a month on eBay that way. But that was very tiring and stressful.
Were you making all the trips down to the post office like crazy, or how did that work?
Yes. Yeah, I was.
That's always the hang up for me. I'm like, I don't want to do any of that.
It was, I was batch processing. So I would literally, you don't understand. I had a route of all the CompUSAs, and I would literally go to each CompUSA and buy the same things, all of their inventory of the same item. Then later that day, I would do the batch photography. Then I would do batch listings. I'd do batch postings. And then I would hope all of them would sell near the same time. And then the next day I would just batch the shipping, and then I'd do it all over again.
So I played this episode. The entire episode is really interesting, but Jay's story, and Steve wasn't on this episode. He got called into some work stuff. But Jay's story is super interesting because he starts out talking about this really dire situation he was in and how he starts just selling stuff out of his house. And then that ended up leading to selling stuff on eBay. And one of his friends was like, hey, I think you should be doing real estate with the type of hustle that you have. And Jay's got a really interesting story in that, like, I think at one point he was up to 500 units that he owned. He's done short-term rentals, as Steve mentioned. He leased a cell phone tower on the top of one of his apartment buildings. He got into wholesaling, and that entire episode, I was just kind of like holding on my seat just because I was blown away by some of the insights that he was giving, especially in the short-term markets or short-term rentals. If you've been interested in doing that, he gives some really good insights on how he was able to leverage other people's apartments and rentals to make money and doing furnished short-term rentals. So definitely listen to 195 if you get the chance with Jay Masty. That's a great episode to listen to.
That's it. That brings us.
You were just going after a butterfly, weren't you?
Yeah, I really was. But yeah, that's it. Thank you everyone for sharing this with us. This is a big milestone, 200 episodes. Not easy to do. We've been at this for a while. Thankfully, Eric came on board and brought new life into the podcast. So thank you, Eric, for that. And
thanks.
You've been an awesome partner and co-host, and I look forward to 200 more. And I know that we're going to change up the format a little bit. If for no other reason, just that we're two guys that get bored kind of easily, and
there's a lot of butterflies to chase.
A lot of butterflies to chase, exactly. So why not just keep chasing and keep doing things, and who knows where it takes us? That's always our philosophy: is just do it, just get out there and do something.
Very original. We did not take that from Nike.
No, well, you know what? A little shout out to Mike Simmons, Just Start Real Estate. He's got a podcast. He's got a great website. He's a guy that kind of preaches the same philosophy. Just start. Just get into it. Buy your first rental. Just do something. Do something today that gets you closer to where you want to be or what you want to do. It's easy to be lazy and say, I don't want to do it, or talk yourself out of it, or have that fear. But just like the podcast for us, we do it and we say, we want to keep trying to make it better and make it fun for us at the same time.
Yeah, and you can actually find a episode where you had Just Start Real Estate on the podcast.
We sure did.
Yeah, I'm not seeing it. Oh, there it is, episode number 17. So yeah, check that out too.
Actually, we did a really interesting one on his podcast. If you want to go listen on his podcast for us, we did a live reveal of a tenant screening report that he ran. and we actually go through the results, and he actually picks his tenant live.
Ooh.
Yeah, kind of exciting stuff.
Yeah. So if you got one takeaway from this episode, besides going back and listening to all these episodes that we've been highlighting, and you can find this in the description of this episode, we'll have notes on all this. Also, join the Rent Prep for Landlords Facebook group if you haven't already. What we're planning on doing is actually live recording future episodes where we're going to kind of maybe turn it into a little bit more of a talk show and try to get it a little bit more engaging as we go live through the shows. We'll see how it goes. It's a little experiment. Maybe it fails horribly, but you can watch us fail live.
Yeah, tune in for the train wreck.
All right. We should be doing that maybe in about a couple episodes because Steve's going to be out of the office next week, but we look forward to trying that little bit of experiment out, and give us a review on iTunes if you're listening and following along. We appreciate it. We read your reviews, and we love seeing those. So, all right, until the next 200th episode, right?
Yeah. Thank you to everyone.
All right, take care, everybody.